Hello, I'm Silvia Amaro, reporter at CNBC. Welcome to this event. Now, the aim of this panel is to understand how the lockdowns have impacted our economies. Who's being shut out, why, and what sort of government response is needed? These are just some of the questions that we'll address. And in order to do that, I have with me two very special guests. Gita Gopinath, the IMF's chief economist, and Joakim Reiter, the Group External Affairs Director at Vodafone. Now, actually, Vodafone has been collecting some data that has helped the IMF in the development of the latest World Economic Outlook. So I would like to start with you, Joakim. Tell us about this data that you've gathered.
Well, thank you very much. At the start of this pandemic, we realized very quickly that in addition to ensuring everyone stayed connected, Vodafone could make an important contribution by using the data that we collect from our networks to create what we call mobility insights. So we quickly built the capability to extract mobility and behavioral insights from our data, of course in a fully anonymized and aggregated way that protects privacy. These insights can help governments and health authorities assess how well their public health strategies are working and ultimately help reduce the spread of the virus, including, for example, what is often referred to as flattening the curve. Vodafone's big data team is in a unique position to provide these mobility insights, as telecom data offers a very strong representation of society with low rates of fake accounts as well as high frequency of data collection. So as shown here in Italy, our data can provide a view of mobility during the pandemic at a national level, as well as at a regional level. In addition to showing basic mobility patterns, we have developed some metric which can provide a view of behavioral changes in society under lockdowns. These include estimates of distance traveled from home and the amount of time spent at home, and how these change across time. We can see here in the UK that there is a clear drop in distances traveled from the home as a result of lockdown policies. As we move through time, we can see the colors on the map getting lighter and lighter as lockdown was imposed, indicating that people are staying closer to home. Then as the lockdowns are eased, the colors start to darken, showing people moving further from home again. We can also see how this varies across regions. When we combine these data insights with data from partners such as the IMF, we can start drawing conclusions on how lockdowns are affecting different segments of our societies and economies, which can be used to inform government policy. And I'll hand over to Gita now to talk more about this.
Thank you, Joakim. Vodafone data provides very detailed information, particularly for different demographics. It distinguishes between women and men and between different age groups. So we use this data for 3 European countries, namely Italy, Portugal, and Spain, to shed light on how this crisis is affecting various demographies. So I'm going to start with showing you that there has been a disproportionate effect of this crisis on women. Now, this chart shows you how mobility has changed with the introduction of stay-at-home orders in Italy, Portugal, and Spain. Now, each dot shows the mobility level in a province for people aged 25 to 44. The red dots represent women, the blue dots represent men, and the left of the chart shows you mobility before stay-at-home orders were imposed, and the right after they were imposed. What you can clearly see is that the adoption of stay-at-home orders led to a considerable drop in mobility, both for men and women, the magnitude being around 20%. Yet the impact on women is larger. You see, for example, that most of the dots in the largest mobility decline are red dots, accounting for about 54% of the total. So our research shows that this disproportionate effect on women was largely due to school closures, highlighting the uneven burden that women face in caring for young children. Now, I'm going to move to the next graph, which helps us look at the impact of this crisis on different age groups. Now, we find that stay-at-home orders had a significantly stronger impact on mobility of people below 44 years old. For example, you see that almost all the dots experiencing the largest mobility decline are people below 44 years old. Now, this again reflects the challenges faced by households with young children when schools are closed, but it also reflects the fact that younger workers have temporary job contracts and which are more likely to be terminated during a crisis. Now, let me turn to some more data on the impact of this crisis on women. Now, as we know that in past recessions, men were often more at risk. For instance, after the global financial crisis, jobs in the construction sector were more harder hit, and men are more employed in this sector. But this crisis is very different. The pandemic has affected contact-intensive sectors like tourism and hospitality that employ many more women. Now, our research looks into this impact, and what you see is what you're seeing on the screen there is data from Indeed, which is a job listing website for more than 20 countries. The chart on the left shows you data for manufacturing, and the chart on the right shows you data for personal care. The red dots represent women, the blue dots represent men. As you can see, there are a greater fraction of those employed in manufacturing are men, while on the other hand, most of the employment there is of women. Now, what the animation will show you is how job postings have disappeared starting from 15 days before stay-at-home orders up to 30 days after. Now, we see that jobs started to decline in the personal care sector sooner than in manufacturing, even before stay-at-home orders were imposed, which is what you would expect when people become much more concerned about contact-intensive activities because you end up contracting the virus. Further, we can see that the decline of job postings in the personal care sector was much larger than in the manufacturing sector, which tells you again that these kinds of sectors will have a slower recovery as long as we are living with the virus. So both the Vodafone data and the Indeed data have been very helpful for us to understand the impact of this crisis on youth and young workers and on women, which has been very important for us in developing our policy advice.
Well, thank you to both of you for breaking down the information for us, really. I would like to start and focus now the discussion on the vulnerable groups. So, Gita, I would like to ask you, essentially, what can be done to prevent that women and young people are actually shut out of the workplace?
Yes, Silvia, there is a lot that needs to be done. Firstly, it's very important to provide a strong social safety net to protect people who are losing their jobs. But it's also very important to provide opportunities to the unemployed to transition into the new sectors. And this will require providing training to acquire the new skills. And secondly, it's also important to provide parental leave to both men and women so that when schools are closed, both of them have an equal share in childcare responsibilities. So these kinds of measures will help make this crisis kind of less uneven on its impact on young and women.
Joakim, I know that Vodafone has also been doing quite a lot of work when it comes to the benefits of connectivity. So I wanted to ask you, how do you see the role of digital infrastructure when it comes to supporting women and young people?
Well, I mean, one of the lessons from the COVID crisis is clear, which is the essential nature that digital infrastructure, as well as the digital services that sit on top, has played in maintaining some form of normality under rather unprecedented circumstances. However, we are dealing with some very significant divides in our society, and these divides requires government and industry to come together to overcome. One of them is the fact that many of our citizens remain unconnected, which means that their access to education or e-learning platforms, their access to healthcare in form of e-health has not existed for those that are clearly not connected. And that's a very significant proportion of the world population. But we also have a number of other things that we're expecting and hoping that both the industry and the governments can come together. I think for us, in terms of the direct policy consequences of the IMF report, which we are incredibly proud that we had the opportunity to collaborate with the IMF on, is that it fundamentally shows the need for governments to use data as a means of driving insights that lead them to right policy choices. So in this case, this analysis shows that there is an absolute necessity of targeted interventions beyond the usual horizontal measures that government have to address those that are struggling and those that are most in need. In particular, we think that there is a very strong argument here for extra support to ensure that we continue to make progress towards gender equality, but also overcome some of the divides that unfortunately the unequal distribution in digital tools may run the risk of deepening further unless we watch out. I would like to stress as well that that's not only the role for government. I think Gita made a number of points which actually applies to business as well. And if you look at a company like Vodafone, we take that very seriously. That includes flexibility to staff, creating workplace policies that are considerate of personal circumstances, that allows people to manage private life and work-life balance under extraordinarily complicated circumstances, including their caring responsibilities. But also to make sure that we are constantly driving to reach those that are currently outside the labor market and bring them back in during and more importantly also as we surface out of this crisis, including youth unemployment opportunities. So we really think that business plays a crucial role of learning from these insights and play its part in the response to make sure that we overcome some of the inequalities that unfortunately the virus, as well as the measures to contain the virus, unfortunately will drive.
Right. I would like to turn to some questions that we received in the run-up to our discussion. And Pishal Simpson from the Ministry of Finance and Development Planning in Liberia asks, how can countries with low economic fundamentals reverse the setbacks on the mobility of women caused by the lockdowns to the gains achieved prior to the era of COVID-19 when the pandemic is finally over? Gita, what's your advice on this one?
I mean, firstly, I think we have to remember that the world still doesn't provide all the opportunities that women need. There is still a lot more investment that's needed in health and education, in terms of financial inclusion, in terms of legal rights. And all of that has to continue. I mean, you have to continue investing in those institutions. You have to continue improving that. Now, this crisis has hit women particularly hard. There are many more in the informal sector, and that's why even in low-income countries, they've been very hard hit. It's very important, again, to provide women with income support, to make sure that this crisis doesn't become a permanent impact on their livelihoods, to provide them with the right skills and right platforms that they need to move towards growing sectors. So these kinds of measures will be needed. And again, like I said, we have to continue the progress that we are making in terms of providing more opportunities to women.
Just very briefly, Gita, could you just explain to us what are the long-term economic ramifications of gender gaps?
So this is something we have studied in great depth. I mean, even before you go to the long term, what we know right now is because of the fact that there's not enough participation of women in the workforce, that has a direct effect on economic activity in terms of just the headline GDP numbers. You could increase growth much more significantly if there was greater participation of women. Secondly, there has to be greater diversity in terms of ideas, in terms of innovation, and bringing women into the workforce has a big impact. We also know that when women have jobs, when they're in leadership position, it helps not just them, but their entire household and the next generation. So there are many steps that need to be taken to access this tremendous resource that countries have, but they are not fully utilizing.
Joakim, let me ask you about the second wave, which is something that we're already experiencing in Europe. How can the data that you've gathered and similar mobility data actually be used by governments and health authorities as they face this new wave of infections?
Unfortunately, the circumstances we're in has proven the point of that this is not a short-term sprint. This is going to be a marathon that we are going to battle through, and it's very distressing with the development that we now see in the country I live in, as well as in many other countries, where we are basically moving towards what I would describe as a twin challenge or twin crisis of both a health crisis combined with an economic, very deep economic crisis. So we hope that obviously that governments will use our data and these insights derived from it, not only from a public health perspective, where it was where we started this, but also based on the manner in which IMF has shown the value of this data to inform economic and social policy. Frankly, governments are now trying to strike a very difficult balance between containing the virus through lockdowns or different measures and the survival of their economies already deeply scarred from the first onslaught of the virus. So local lockdowns and fast action to, say, contact tracing will play a critical role, both of which are underpinned by data insights that show population behaviors. So we are ready, of course, to collaborate with governments and IMF, and we're in discussions with UNICEF and the World Bank on providing the right insights to help get through this crisis. So I think with respect to what the points that Gita made, and I would like to amplify those, I think it's a responsibility of all stakeholders, including the private sector, to face up to the reality that the consequences of this crisis and this current twin crisis is not equally shared. It's not a burden equally shared between men or women or middle-aged men like myself and youth. And we have a special responsibility to try to tackle these challenges head on and make sure that we don't deepen the divides that already existed at an unacceptable level in our society. So, give you a concrete example, a stark example here in the UK, which the Institute for Fiscal Studies have found, is that mothers were 1.5 times more likely than fathers to have either quit or lost their jobs during the lockdown. And this is a very real implications of lockdown on gender equality. So unless we're moving to a proactive stage of targeted interventions to try to address these growing inequalities coming out of the crisis, once we resurface in 1 year from now or wherever we will be, our societies will have been polarized even more when it comes to incomes, opportunities, and that is something that certainly is not in anyone's interest. So we hope that these insights into different segments of society will be taken into consideration when it comes to building back after the pandemic by providing a much clearer baseline and by encouraging data-driven decision-making, which we absolutely think is essential, and we're happy to do our part.
Thank you to both of you for the insightful discussion. Let's hope that we as a collective can actually work towards a more equal society. So thank you, Gita, and thank you, Joakim. And of course, thank you to all of you who joined us today and participated in our debate. All the best, and I hope to see you soon.